Hello, and welcome to the Canadian Global Affairs Institute's webinar that we are recording on March 28th. I'm your host, Colin Robertson. Today, we explore the mood of Americans who go to the polls in 227 days. With Super Tuesday and other key primaries behind us, both President Joe Biden and former President Donald Trump have won the delegates they need to win their party nominations at their conventions this summer. The Republicans will meet in Milwaukee in mid-July and the Democrats in Chicago in late August. While the focus is always on the presidency, these elections also involve all 435 members of the House of Representatives, one-third of the 100-member Senate, 11 governors, state and local legislators, as well as various referendum measures. While Canadian political leadership should stay out of the election campaign, we will be watching closely the leaders' pronouncements and the party platforms as they relate to trade and investment, defense and security, immigration and the border, climate, energy, and the environment. In January, Prime Minister Trudeau launched a Team Canada trade and investment effort led by Industry Minister François-Philippe Champagne and Trade Minister Mary Ng, working with Ambassador Kirsten Hillman. It is intended to mobilize business, entrepreneurs, organized labor, civil society groups, and different orders of government to make sure, as the Prime Minister put it, we're ready to continue to benefit as Canadians from a strong relationship with the United States. This effort will also position Canada for the 2026 review of our North American trading arrangement that was renegotiated under President Trump. To help us situate the issues and attitudes of Americans, I'm delighted to welcome back our presenter, Bruce Stokes. Bruce is Senior Visiting Fellow at the German Marshall Fund, Associate Fellow at Chatham House, and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. We've all benefited from Bruce's previous presentations. To discuss what this all means for Canada, I welcome our commentators, the Honourable Perrin Beatty, Laura Dawson, and the Honourable Frank McKenna. Perrin is President and CEO of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. He previously served as our Foreign and Defence Minister, as President of the CBC, and as CEO of the Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters. Laura is Executive Director of the US-Canada Future Borders Coalition. Amongst other positions, she also served as Director of the Wilson Center's Canada Institute. Frank is Deputy Chair of TD Securities. He previously served as Canadian Ambassador to the United States and as Premier of New Brunswick. As to procedure, Bruce will present his slides for the next 20 or so minutes. Then Perrin, Laura, and Frank will comment on the presentation and what it means for Canada. I'll ask a couple of questions, and then our producer, Joe Calnan, will pose your questions. So please do use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Thank you. Bruce, over to you.
Colin, thanks so much for inviting me, and I really appreciate the interest that you and all Canadians have in the U.S. election. As I like to joke, the ultimate unfairness of the American elections is that we get to elect the leader of the world, and none of you get to vote on who that leader is. So I look forward to Frank and Perrin and Laura's comments and interpretation of the data I'm about to share, plus the questions that are always very stimulating from the audience. So why don't we start with this presentation. First off, just to give you a sense of generally where what people are thinking about in terms of concerns, as far as we know. This is a Gallup poll that shows that the range of people's concerns. A couple things to point out is that the concern about immigration has grown a bit between January and February. And I also always like to point out to foreign audiences that foreign policy, foreign aid, and a focus overseas is down there at kind of such a low level that it's not even worth discussing. It's 2% and 3%. This will not come as a surprise to Canadian audiences. The American public is divided along partisan lines on almost every issue, no matter what you ask them about. And as you can see, these are fairly large divisions on things like strengthening the economy. Democrats less worried about that than Republicans, who are very worried about it. Defending against terrorism, If you go down this list, what's interesting is that the issue that people are probably most uh, closely aligned with is on global trade, and both Republicans and Democrats give this almost no priority. The economy, which, as I noted in that first slide, is a large concern of people, but people's perceptions of the economy are improving, but they are still very partisan in their perception of the economy. The partisan differential in consumer sentiment was about 20 points in 2021 when the Biden administration started. It's now 40 points. So you have to ask yourself whether this is really about the economy or it is a partisan view by Republicans that Joe Biden can do nothing right, and Democrats' views that Biden is doing a good job on the economy. By 3-1, Republicans more than Democrats say the border situation is a crisis. Again, strong overall concern about immigration in that first slide, but as you can see, it's a very partisan concern. The Biden campaign wants to again stress the threat that authoritarianism poses for American democracy. If those of you who watched Biden's State of the Union address, some of his most impassioned remarks were in the last 3 or 4 minutes of that State of the Union, where he talked about the need to defend democracy. This is truly an issue the president cares a great deal about. This finding from a recent poll showed that 46% of Republicans and frankly 25% of Democrats said that the country needed a strong leader and not impeded by the courts and Congress. So there's an underlying appeal for authoritarianism among actually a broad swath of the American public. On international issues, Americans are dissatisfied with the position of the U.S. in the world today. As you can see, it peaked way back at the end of the Clinton administration. It's really been downhill ever since, but it's a very partisan perception. And again, this is a question of, is this really about how people see the U.S. position in the world? Or is it just if my guy's in the White House, everybody outside of the United States loves us? And frankly, if the other guys in the White House, then obviously they hate us. And Republicans and Democrats are guilty of this very skewed perception of the U.S. Position in the world. This is a very interesting question the Chicago Council has asked over the years about should the U.S. take an active role in world affairs. And as you can see, for many years, Republicans were much more supportive of that, going back to 1974. But in the last decade or so, Republican support for an active U.S. role in the world has plummeted, whereas the perception of Democrats to see a more active role in the U.S. In the world has actually grown. I submit to you that in many of these questions, this is a reflection of the changing nature of the two parties and their constituencies. The Democratic Party is increasingly a party of urban dwellers, of highly educated people, and actually fairly well-off people. The Republican Party is increasingly a party of rural dwellers, people with less education, often people of a lower income. And this may reflect the divide that's happened demographically in the two parties more than, again, an actual perception of what people want. They're reflecting their engagement with the world or their fear of the world in this finding. Notably, and I think this comes as no surprise, starting with President Trump, isolationism among Republicans has grown, and it's grown dramatically. If you look back to the beginning of the Trump administration, it has increased significantly. Whereas isolationism with Democrats, again, I think in part because of the changing nature of the demographic of the Democratic Party, is fairly low. Strong majorities are very or somewhat concerned about being drawn into some foreign conflict. I think this is a legacy of Afghanistan, a legacy of Iraq, maybe even for some people of the Vietnam era, where people are just afraid that if we're engaged in the world, we're likely to be drawn into a conflict which they don't want. Moreover, and this is a very interesting finding, I think, when you kind of lay out what could be the U.S. foreign policy goals around two sets of issues, Hamas, Israel, and Ukraine, there's a lack of confidence that, in fact, we could actually achieve those goals, which I think reflects a lack of confidence in the U.S. ability to shape the world in the way it might want. If you can't shape the world in the way you want, then why are you engaging in the world? On Ukraine, a largely back burner issue at this point in Washington, for example, with the Congress unable to agree on Ukrainian aid, um, and with the presidential candidate Donald Trump threatening again to pull back from NATO, what you see is that three times as many Republicans as Democrats say they want to decrease or end U.S. NATO commitments. Now, I would point out to you, though, that you've got a plurality among both Democrats, Republicans, and independents who say they keep the commitment of what it is now. Frankly, if you ask people what our commitment was, no. So there is a certain support for the status quo. Three times as many Republicans as Democrats say the U.S. gives too much aid to Ukraine. This is what's driving the stalemate in the House of Representatives, where conservatives do not want to move on Ukrainian aid, or Israel aid for that matter, or aid to Taiwan. But the real issue the holdup really seems to be around aid to Ukraine. The news claims that they will have a proposal once the Congress comes back in mid-April. We'll see what that is and whether it has any traction. I think people cynically believe that there will be an aid package for Ukraine, but they've actually thought that might happen for the last few months, and it hasn't. On Israel-Hamas, half of Americans approved of Israeli military action in Gaza in November of 2023. Now only a third approve of it. So there is a dramatic decline in U.S. support for what Israel is doing in Gaza. Not surprisingly, a majority of Muslims, but also a majority of Democrats and nearly half of young people say Israel's actions in Gaza are unacceptable. This has political implications for the Democratic Party. Democrats believe the U.S. is too supportive of Israel. Republicans believe the U.S. is too supportive of the Palestinians. Donald Trump has stayed out of this fray for the most part, but the assumption is he would be, as a president, very supportive of the Netanyahu government, as he was when he was president before. Half of Americans support humanitarian aid for Gaza, but only just over a third back military aid for Israel. So again, this is a headache for the Biden administration because there's this declining support for military aid for Israel. This is a long-term trend which should trouble people in Jerusalem greatly. Young Americans are losing faith in Israel. This is a 2-year trend in the wake of October 7th and what the Israelis did after October 7th. But I can tell you, this support among young people for Israel has been going down for years. In terms of the horse race, I mean, my first caution would be it's way too early to know who's going to win this election. It's 7 months away. Anything could happen. There could be an economic crisis. There could be an international crisis. The economy could get much better. We just don't know. The stock market could get better. It's way too early to tell. But right now, the election is currently, I think, in most of the major respected polls, a dead heat, with with the difference between support for Biden or Trump being within the margin of error. As Canadians know quite well, we don't elect president by popular vote. We elect that person through the votes of the Electoral College, which means you have to win individual states. The assumption among professional politics watchers is that it'll get down to 6 or 7 states. These are the 6 states in yellow brown there that people think will be the bellwether states, the contested states. The Democrats think that North Carolina can also be, and so that it's 7 states, not just 6. We'll see. They've tried to win North Carolina in the last 2 elections and failed. But the most recent polling that just came out 2 days ago by Bloomberg shows that in the 7 states that may be the battleground states, Biden and Trump are now effectively tied in 4 of those, and Trump leads in the other 3. This was not the case before, so I do think it reflects a general improvement in Biden's campaign in just the last couple of months. Not surprisingly, Biden's leading among women, college graduates, and the young. Trump's leading among men, non-college graduates, and the elderly. Biden's age continues to be a concern for the public, whereas Trump, who's not that much older, I mean, he's 4 years younger, I think, will be, and if he were elected, he would be the oldest man inaugurated as president. People don't see him as having mental and physical stamina issues. And I think that it is almost perception that matters more than reality. It is true that Biden talks like an old man, walks like an old man. Trump exhibits much more vigor, even though this is a guy who has a horrible diet, never exercises, and you would think is probably in worse overall health, but that's not how the public perceives him. People wonder. Trump is now charged with 58. I think it's down from 61 to 58 different criminal charges. How this will affect people's perception. The questions that are being asked now are often, if he's found guilty of these alleged crimes, how would you feel about that? People divide along partisan lines, as might expect, but basically half of all Americans think he is guilty of these various crimes. Whether he will be called to judgment on any of these things before the election, I think, is a separate issue. Except in the Manhattan case, which we may have a conclusion before the election, but the other 3 cases, it's not at all really clear whether they will come to some conclusion before the election. Not good news for Biden. People aren't sure that he's striking the right balance in Israel-Hamas. At the same time, different poll, an Ipsos poll, people are generally more confident in Trump resolving the Palestinian-Israel conflict, the Ukraine conflict, and even improving our relationship with China. You might ask yourself, how is it that people think it's going to improve our relationship with China when he's threatening 60% tariffs on Chinese exports to the United States? But people don't follow these details. I think what's important, though, is that only about half the public has an opinion on this stuff. So these basically a third of the public that say Trump would do a better job may actually reflect the fact that there's about a third of the public who are true MAGA Trump believers, and that this may reflect just an overall sense that he would do a great job on any issue because he's our guy, rather than people have actually have thought through how he would handle a particular issue. This is an interesting poll in the sense that trade is not going to be a major issue in the election, but the public is more likely to approve of Trump's approach to foreign trade than to Biden's approach to foreign trade. Frankly, Biden doesn't have much of a trade policy. He just continued a lot of the Trump trade policies. But Trump has threatened, massive tariffs on imports, an across the board 10% tariff on all imports, a 60% tariff on Chinese products coming into the United States. I would think that most people don't know the details of that or have even heard that, but on trade, Americans have historically wanted a tough guy. And I think they just think that Trump is tougher than Biden on trade. One final sobering thought, though, as because of the electoral college system, it is not inconceivable that depending on how the states break out, say if Trump wins in Pennsylvania and Michigan, but Biden wins in Georgia, Arizona, Nevada, we could have a tie in the electoral college. And in that event, the House of Representatives would get to vote. The newly elected House of Representatives would get to vote, which each state having one vote, depending on how their delegations break down. And frankly, if that were today, Trump would be the next president because the Republicans lead in the delegation count in 26 states. How it'll happen, what will happen after the election, we just don't know. But I can assure you that this, I think, would lead to incredible turmoil in the United States because we haven't had to do this for well over 100 years. And when we did it in 1876, it led to a very ugly scene and the return of Jim Crow in the South as a result. So with that sobering note, I'll leave this to our discussion. Take care.
Well, thanks, Bruce. On that sobering note, let me turn to the panel, and I'm going to ask Perrin to lead on this one. Your takeaways from what you've just seen from Bruce and what it means for Canada. Perrin.
Colin, it's a very sobering poll. And I think for anybody looking at it who's concerned about the relationship with the US and the role of the US in terms of providing leadership in the world, we should be very concerned about where we are at the present time in so many different areas in terms of promoting global security and in terms of promoting global trade. Unless the US is in the driver's seat, unless they're really pushing ahead, we're going to find ourselves slipping back. And what the polling shows is a United States that increasingly is turning inward, and one that is coming increasingly to see itself as being victimized by the rest of the world, as opposed to seeing the rest of the world and American leadership as an opportunity. The other thing that stands out to me from Bruce's poll is, first of all, the fact that they're turning inward and turning away from the world. The second is the tribalism. The question that I have when I look at these figures is, do the leaders reflect public opinion, or does public opinion reflect the leadership? And increasingly what we're seeing in Canada as well as the United States, although it's more considerably more severe in the United States, is that people are choosing what side they're on issues based on what team they belong to. And with Donald Trump taking a very aggressive position in terms of trade in particular, this doesn't bode well for Canada and doesn't bode well for the global economy in general, quite apart from the US role in the world in other areas. So it's a sobering poll. I think we should all be concerned about it, and we should be watching very closely.
Thanks, Perrin. Certainly the insularity comes through, and as you say, tribalism as well. Laura, what about you from your perspective?
Thanks. I thank you. Yeah, as a Canadian living in the United States, I am very concerned about the perception of Canada and trade and U.S. relationship with its allies in the U.S. And it is, it's concerning who wins the next election, but as Perrin noted, it's the direction of public opinion and really the sense that the well is being poisoned on trade that is most concerning for me. I believe that the U.S. trade and border relationship with Canada is being weaponized against Joe Biden by the far right in the United States. There was a recent speech in which the banner over the stage behind Donald Trump read, "Where globalism goes to die." And what Canadians don't realize is this includes us. We are global, we are foreign. It's not just China or Russia that are being targeted. Canadians are Canadians are also dismissed as being foreign, as taking jobs from Americans. And most Americans don't realize that Canada is their largest customer, nor do they realize that actions against Canada also hurt their own American bottom line. And I'm really concerned that if Donald Trump is elected, there will be an immediate and profound backlash against Canada. The 10% universal tariff that Bruce mentioned, I don't think there's any doubt that that would be applied against Canada as well. Trade agreements be damned. It may not last through congressional approval, but it could certainly be imposed on the short term as an emergency presidential measure, and we've seen that before. I'm concerned about militarization of the border. Americans don't tend to differentiate much between the northern and southern border. Bad stuff comes over the border, and Canada is on the northern border, and factors, numbers don't really make a difference. Tiny amounts of fentanyl versus huge amounts of fentanyl, tiny amounts of irregular migration versus huge amounts of irregular migration. It doesn't matter. There's bad stuff coming over the border, and people like Elise Stefanik, who is in upstate New York, is looking to be a potential vice president for Donald Trump. She's willing to weaponize that northern border position. And how long could our supply chains last if we had the same sort of militarization and troops stationed on the northern border as we do on the southern border? And finally, I'm also concerned that this election campaign, it's poisoning the well against trade just as we're heading into the 2026 USMCA or CUSMA review. There's not going to be a lot of folks willing to fly the flag for free trade as we go into that very important 2026 review. So I'm encouraged by the seriousness that Canada is taking the Team Canada initiative, especially François-Philippe Champagne. He is in the US twice a week, different city every week. He must have huge frequent flyer points. But I'm still worried about the approach that the Team Canada initiative is taking. At this stage, it's still a public relations exercise. It's a we build things together, not focusing on US security and fears and dependency. The message that we need to take to the United States is we've got your backs, and identify the 5 or 6 areas of US dependency on Canada, and then identify the specific benefits in US regions and tag those to US influencers and those who can reach out to a potential Trump White House. And those 5 or 6 areas we all know: it's energy, it's critical minerals, it's agricultural markets, it's an integrated auto sector, semiconductors, medicines, and Arctic security. That's the main set, I think. And Americans need to be very clear that Canada is part of the solution as far as the problems that are unsettling them and making them nervous. They also, going back to Bruce's slides, they're worried about irregular migration, they're worried about drugs. So we need to show that Canada is a full partner on these high priority issues like managing migration and fentanyl. Again, it's very small numbers, but Canada's got a role to play in managing hemispheric migration. We've done some things already. We need to continue to do more proactive team building with the United States, and on fentanyl to close the gaps where we can. And finally, we need to mobilize quickly. In the absence of what every other country in the world has in the United States, which is a Mexican-American chamber, a Chinese-American chamber, a Argentinian-American chamber. We don't have that in the United States for Canada. And so organizations like Canadian Chamber of Commerce and our organization, we're running around like crazy doing ad hoc work, but we don't have that institutional basis. So it makes it harder. So we're rising to the occasion, government, industry, organizations. I hope it's going to be enough, but I am afraid of rough times ahead.
So Frank, it's been somewhat depressing. Insularity, protectionism, militarization of the border. What do you see from listening to Bruce and his polls?
Yeah. So, Colin, I've turned my video off because I'm having trouble with the audio here. Can you hear me clearly?
Yeah, we can hear you. That's great, Frank.
Okay. Sorry you can't see me because I look pretty good today. But just a couple of quick takes out of the polling that's been done. So I'll talk to that at the beginning. First of all, advantage Republican on the issues that Americans seem to care about the most. And in politics, we always look at degrees of salience. Highest degrees of salience are around immigration, economy, and the Republicans score big on those. So that is certainly an advantage for them going forward. On the other side, advantage Democrats. There's only one way that interest rates can go, and that's downwards. And America's in the funniest situation where they have the most robust economy in the world, but the government doesn't get credit for that. So there's a real perception issue. Possibly downward trending interest rates would help with that. Progress on the southern border would help a lot, considering the salience of the immigration section. And it's not surprised that Trump would deep six the bipartisan agreement on the southern border when you look at the politics of it. So that is one. Winding down of the war in the Middle East will help Democrats because it may take that conflict off the table. Michigan, in particular, would be vulnerable on that issue alone. So I think it would be important for Democrats to have that come to an end. Criminal convictions, we didn't specifically, I think, in this poll look at that, but an actual conviction prior to the election, by all accounts in all polls, would affect the result. And then the age issue. I thought, and maybe this accounts for the most recent week or two of polling, but I thought Biden did a good job in the State of the Union address in looking vigorous. And if he can perform at that level in debates, for example, with President Trump, et cetera, or on other occasions, that may sideline the age issue, which otherwise is a big age issue. One other thing, and I think because of today's news, it becomes obvious that it is an advantage Democrat, are the campaign assets available. Number one, Democrats actually are raising more money, especially in a lot of the down ticket races. But secondly, they've got not only President Biden and his wife, they've got President Clinton, Hillary Clinton, they've got Barack Obama, Michelle Obama, all of whom are considerable assets dealing with certain aspects of the Democratic vote. And then there's the Taylor Swift effect. We'll see if she weighs in. But with 300 million Instagram followers, if she can even get more people out to vote, especially people who don't traditionally vote, that would make a difference. When we consider, from Bruce's slide, this is going to come down to 6 or 7 states and probably a couple of 100,000 votes scattered around those states. Everything counts. Then just quickly to conclude for Canada, trade would be a massive negative. Absolutely no doubt about that. We'll be caught up in that issue. The CUSMA reopener is going to force that anyway. Tax cuts would hurt us. The United States is a reserve currency. They can spend until the cows come home. Doesn't seem to matter. But for other countries, getting into a spending battle, it would be very difficult. And remember, the last round of Trump tax cuts were really financed by deficit financing. Climate mitigation would be a negative for us because our industries would be less competitive because we're exposed to a stricter regime if that were to change. Immigration could be a huge positive for us. If the United States, either in deed or perception, is closing its borders or its mind to immigrants, we have a chance to take the most talented people in the world in our country. And then finally, the potential for gridlocks. is probably a net positive for Canada. In the United States, we have to keep remembering it's the House of Representatives, it's Senate, it's the presidency. It would appear that the Senate is probably going to switch. High degree of probability it'll be a Republican Senate, but a reasonable degree of probability that the House of Representatives may go Democratic. So we may end up having gridlock government, which tends to mitigate some of the damage that a president could impose on the rest of the world.
Thanks, Frank. I'm going to ask Joe, who's been watching the questions, if you could pose a couple of questions from the audience.
Yes, of course, Colin. Thank you. And thank you to our panelists. So we've gotten a number of great questions here, and I encourage the audience to submit more questions because we might have time to get to them as well. Yeah, we have about 22 minutes, so we can field a good number of questions here. But the first one, and this was from an anonymous attendee, is a question on women's views of Trump and Biden, and in particular where it comes to abortion rights and what it could mean for the upcoming election. So if any of the panelists would like to take that
Sure,
on.
I think I'll put that one to Bruce. Bruce, Trump, Biden on abortion.
The Democratic Party and the Biden machine think that the abortion issue will work very well for them, and that you can expect, I think, a strong messaging that if Trump is elected, but even on the down ballot issues of the House or the Senate, if you elect certain people, there'll be new restrictions on abortion. There have been a number of state elections in 2022 where there were referenda on the ballot, kind of trying to incorporate abortion protections into the state constitution. Those were all successful. So there's going to be an attempt to put more of those referenda on the ballot in especially key states like Ohio or wherever. And if that happens, the Democrats hope that this will turn out more women. Now, the caveat here is, though, a close analysis of people who voted on these state abortion issues in 2022, people would come out and say, no, we want protections for abortion in our state constitution, and they still voted for Republicans down and on other races. So I think it's the assumption that Democrats are making is that abortion will help them, the abortion issue will help them in protecting abortion rights, but I think they may be more optimistic than the underlying data would suggest they should be. Frankly, turnout is turnout. And if you get a bigger turnout, I think that's actually good for democracy, however people vote.
Bruce, I'm going to follow up with a question of my own. You know, the economy is improving. You would think Joe Biden would be getting more credit for it. But I'm sort of reminded of the James Carville quote that it's the economy stupid. But there's a new book out, Fried Zakaria, The Age of Revolutions, in which he says that it's not so much about economic issues anymore that drive voters, but identity and divisions around class, culture, and tribe. Your slide sort of implies that may be the case. What do you think?
I totally agree with Fareed on that. I think one of the things I've learned from dealing with polling for more than a decade as a pollster, but also then as a reporter before that, is that I had to come to the realization that human beings are infinitely capable of holding mutually contradictory emotions at the same time. So when you ask people how the economy is doing, they increasingly say it's doing pretty well. When you ask them about their, actually, I take that back. When you ask them about their personal finances, they will say that things are getting better. When you ask about the economy, they really split along partisan lines and say the economy's lousy. We know from other polling that if you get most of your economic news from Fox News, you're much more likely to say the economy is in bad shape than if you get your news from MSNBC. But I also think pollsters and economists miss the point in the sense that there are just a couple of issues where people tend to focus their concerns: rent which has been very high. So if you're a renter, that is a concern. The mortgage rate. So if you want to be a home buyer, and 60% of Americans own their own home, or so they're constantly in the market looking and changing domicile. It's at the grocery store and at the gas pump. And those prices, those costs remain very high. And let's face it, they're not likely to go down very much. Rent is going down a little bit. Hopefully the mortgage rate will go down a little bit. But I always like to joke that most prices are inflexible downward. They don't go down very much. And in fact, as we head into this, gas prices are going to go back up. They've already gone up 30 cents in the last month or so. So I think that even though you would assume, based on the stock market, based on the strength of the economy, based on job creation, that people would feel better about the economy than they do, they don't. And I think many of those issues that plague the Democratic Party and Biden around the economy are issues that Biden's not going to be able to do much with, because he can't affect the price of gasoline, for example. One final point, though, on the tribalism issue that Perrin actually raised, and I wanted to actually jump in when he said this. I think we have to accept the fact that increasingly, as Perrin said, people in the United States identify with a party. I'm a Republican or I'm a Democrat, and that then influences how they feel about issues. We kind of think in theory, what people say, oh, I'm against abortion, so I should be a Republican, or I'm for low taxes, I should be a Republican. And I think we increasingly believe, pollsters increasingly believe, that people, join the cult of Donald Trump. And then, oh, if I'm a Trump supporter, then I need to be, for this or that. And if that's the case, the problem with that, it seems to me, is that democratic dialogue, where you might try to rationally change someone's point of view, is increasingly difficult, because their point of view has nothing to do with how they thought about the issue and they thought it through and maybe they changed their mind. It is, no, I'm a Trump supporter and Trump supporters have to believe this. And that forms their view, rather than they have their views and then they join the Trump camp or the Biden camp.
Which takes us back to identity and tribe. Joe, a question maybe that would pose to our Canadian commentators.
For sure, Colin. And yeah, this question focuses more on the Canadian side of things. And this is from David Redman. The question is, we talk extensively about the United States as an unreliable partner. But with Canada's concerns about foreign interference in our elections, our lack of commitment to the border, and other areas of Canadian federal government inaction, are we making a good case that Canada is a reliable partner to the United States?
Okay, reliable partner to the U.S. Perrin, why don't you lead on that?
Glad to, Colin. The answer is we are not doing enough. Even the best relationships require that you continue to work at them. You can't take them for granted. And I think to a great extent, after we secured CUSMA, we all heaved a sigh of relief, rolled over, and went back to sleep. And we still, in our relationship with the United States, we've moved from what was once a strategic relationship, where both countries saw the relationship as being important to themselves, that the other did well, and where Canada was seen as a solution to problems rather than being a problem. We've moved to a relationship that's no longer strategic, but that is now transactional. And we will lose every time on that, because transactional issues are dealt with on a one-off basis. We've got to rebuild the relationship. It's going to take time to do that, and we don't have a lot of time, which means we've really got to double down. It goes back to what Laura was saying earlier about the nature of our Team Canada outreach. We have to demonstrate that we're coming with answers, that Canada is an essential partner to the United States and not a threat to American interests. And the other thing we have to do is be very careful about the commentary coming out of Canada. We are, as David was suggesting in his question, we expect that others respect our autonomy and treat us with respect. We bristle if the Americans reach into Canada and start telling us how to vote. We've got to be very careful about offering ex cathedra pronouncements on the American election. And that's particularly the case. I'm worried that if we get into a federal election where one of the political parties decides to play the Trump card and to use Donald Trump as a domestic political club to beat their opponents with in Canada, that will be noticed on the US side of the border, and it will make the relationship very difficult if Mr. Trump gets elected as president. So we need to be circumspect in what we're doing. We need to do much more outreach, and we need to go with solutions rather than with problems.
Laura, I'd like you to speak to this just in regard to the border, which I even focusing a lot of time on, the idea of us being a reliable partner. Because certainly when I turn on Fox, you know, they talk about the southern border and mayhem and murder and drug cartels, but the northern border now is seen to be porous. And as you pointed out, migrants and drugs. And yes, it may be small numbers, but if you treat the northern border like you treat the southern border, we're in for a rather rough ride.
Right. Absolutely. Thanks, Colin. And just to add a emphasis to Perrin and to Bruce, Americans can hold two ideas in their heads at the same time, and they may not necessarily seem consistent from the outside, but it is possible for a Trump supporter and a MAGA Republican to also see the benefits of trade and strong relations with Canada and the allies. And that is the key group, that people with foot in both camps that Canada needs to be reaching out to in the United States. And you know, Americans do read the internet. So if MAGA becomes part of a Canadian election campaign, that's to the detriment of all of us. And remember, it is usually, historically, has been Republicans who have been good for Canadian trade. The Bush Republicans are a bit missing in action now, those moderate free traders. But you know, we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater, and make sure that we must, you know, engage on a multi-partisan or non-partisan basis. On the border, yes, absolutely. Borders are our most important tool of trade facilitation, and we neglect them shamefully. Our border decision makers in Canada and in the United States are working on principles of incrementalism and putting out fires. There's no big vision. There's no long-term plan. And we know that even small interruptions have big effects. The Ottawa Bridge blockade shut down auto assembly lines in Alabama. This most recent tragedy in Baltimore is going to halt about $9 million a day in maritime trade because of the Key Bridge disaster. So, you know, these are essential areas for us to be taking care of, and we're not. We're looking at big investments, and the big investments make headlines, and we're delighted that the Gordie Howe Bridge is going to be a reality, but there's no coordination among the big projects. So my organization, we run around from pillar to post to try to get decision makers and business operators and operational experts around a table to try to get things moving. For example, for the FIFA World Cup 2026, two of three land border crossings between BC and Washington are scheduled to be closed due to maintenance. That's going to make it difficult to move hundreds of thousands of people between Vancouver and Seattle. In Western Canada, cattle trucks have to drive live animals thousands of kilometers out of their way because they can't get veterinarians at the border. We have internalized the notion that we build things together. But in Canada, I think we believe that cross-border our supply chains are necessary. Whereas for investors, they are not at all necessary. If costs become too high or risks are too high, investment moves to the safe, low-cost option. So if you're processing aluminum in Kingston and Oswego, New York, as a big aluminum company does in North America, and there's challenges with the border and there's challenges moving your product, you know, where is your where's your investment going to go? If there's flooding or wildfires in BC and it's hard to move your cargo into the south and then back to the north, why would you continue to use those northern links? There are, example after example after example. And the location in Canada, for most manufacturers, is very precarious. They can be moved by changes in exchange rates, changes in government policy. And so I think that, as you mentioned, a focus on border and transportation networks just makes sense. A Canada-US border authority would be essential to maintain competitiveness and resilience. The biggest problem we have now is not infrastructure investment. It is the intelligent use of infrastructure and getting governments and officials and businesses in place, mandating governments to talk to each other and deliver on specific targets.
Thanks, Laura. Frank, let me put to you, the question of Canada being a reliable partner. Well, of course, we could put the same question to the United States now, especially if Donald Trump comes in. But doesn't it also say that perhaps we need to become more self-reliant? I think in terms of border, as Laura just described, taking big decisions with the border, and we used to be capable of doing big things, and defense and security, where not just the Americans are critical of us, but our allies overseas as well. What do you think? What's our next big idea?
Well, Colin, you're asking a terrific question. I was party, as you know, to the free trade negotiations back in 1988, and again, the NAFTA negotiations. And I would say this, that if it weren't for oil and the need for energy security, the original NAFTA or the original FTA would not have been signed. The Americans had no incentive. So we do need to show that this is a reciprocal, a relationship based on reciprocal advantage. So I'd say two little ideas. First of all, we need to separate ourselves a bit from Mexico. Unfortunately, Mexico has become a bit of a proxy for China now in terms of trade with the United States. And you'll notice that Trump has talked about putting 100% tariff barrier up against auto production coming out of Mexico. They've moved in a direction different from us. We've got a higher cost economy, more similar to the United States. So we need to do a little differentiation. Secondly, critical minerals. We need to exploit our critical minerals. We have 31 of the most critical minerals on the planet. And I think that's a big selling point. But here's my big idea. And it's out of the box. And people will think it's half crazy, but here it is. Generative AI. There's no bigger force in the world now than generative AI. 90% of the world's data was created in the last 2 years. And over the next 2 years, that data will double. New data centers are being created at the rate of 1 every 3 days. And the electricity requirement for that data is going to double by 2026. So what does Canada bring to that party? We bring green power. Because all of these data centers are powered with renewable energy. We bring colder temperatures, which is an absolutely critical component of trying to keep the energy costs down on data centers. And most importantly of all, we have the world's biggest supply of generative AI human talent. We're first in on this. We've got massively important centers in Toronto, Edmonton, Montreal, and other places across the country. We've got enormous talent, and we have the ability to attract immigrants going forward. That may become an even bigger advantage. We have that singular advantage of being able to attract some of the most talented people in the world. So what am I proposing? I'm proposing a single US-Canada seamless integration of capabilities around AI. I'm suggesting that we go from the Auto Pact to the AI Pact.
And that'll take in all sorts of things, both energy, climate, and everything else. It's a good big idea. Perrin, I'm going to put the last question to you because we began talking about the economy and how vital, and we pointed out how dependent we are, as you said in your opening comments. The 2026 review, we've been focusing just on trade and investment. Frank says we need a bigger idea. Laura says we've also got to look at the border. There's also defense and security pieces to this. Are we positioning ourselves well enough for 2026? Perrin?
I'm sorry, I didn't realize you were addressing to me. No, not yet. We aren't. And again, it goes back to what I was saying earlier, that we have to go with solutions. We're the smaller partner. The relationship is more important to us than it is to the United States. And it means then that we've got to be more supple, we've got to be more creative, and we have to go with solutions instead of problems. That certainly includes on security. It's important for us to understand that when you talk to Americans, the security issue counts for at least as much as the trade issue does in terms of the relationship. And the concern that they have is that Canada continues to freeload, that we aren't defending ourselves, let alone contributing enough to common defense. So there's much more that we need to do. But most importantly, it goes back to what Laura said at the outset about us always making the trade and commercial argument. We have to listen to what the Americans are telling us in terms of what's important to them, and position ourselves as partners with solutions rather than as a problem.
So the old thing about, instead of going cap in hand in transactionalism, but going in with ideas, like Frank says, and like Laura says, on big issues, that's how we've made progress. I think of Seaway, I think of the Free Trade Agreement, Smart Border Accord, Acid Rain. That's when we seem to go in with ideas, we seem to do much better. Fair comment?
Well, and Colin, what we've been doing in recent years is constantly going to Washington to ask for an exemption from whatever the latest outrage is. We want Canada carved out. We want special treatment. That's going to fall on deaf ears in Washington. What we need to do is be going to Washington and saying we have solutions to problems that are vexing you.
All right. Thanks, Perrin. And my final question to you all, and I'm going to start with you, Laura. What are you reading or streaming these days?
Great question. I have been a little bit on holiday, so I've been reading a novel. I recommend the new novel by Michael Crummey he's a Newfoundland writer. The novel is called The Adversary. It's got misery, humor, and pirates. It's a great read, but not for the faint of heart.
All right.
I also, I'm looking forward to a new book coming out by our friends and colleagues, Lori Troutman and Ted Alden from Western Washington University. I've read some advanced chapters, and they're just doing a great account of the effects of COVID on the US-Canada border. So I'm really looking forward to their book as well.
All right. Excellent choices. Perrin, what are you reading or streaming?
Not stuff that you're going to be impressed by, newspapers, magazines, reports, emails, and the like. And this is going to continue through until the end of August, when I'll be leaving the chamber. What I intend to do after that is to be able to get some time to devote myself to some of the books that I haven't had a chance to read. For example, I've had Neil Ferguson's biography of Kissinger sitting there for the last couple of years waiting to be read, and that's high on my priority list.
All right. Kissinger by Neil Ferguson. Frank, what are you reading or streaming these days?
Well, I'm like Perrin. I spend my whole life tucked into newspapers, podcasts, etc. But right now, I'm starting to work on Fareed Zakaria's Age of Revolutions. He's my guest at my Fox Harbor event this summer, so I have to sound intelligent when I interview him. So I'm trying to work my way through that book.
Oh, great choice. Age of Revolutions, Fareed Zakaria. Bruce, finally, thank you. And what are you reading or streaming these days?
Well, my wife and I are just finishing up on the Apple TV mini series on Pierre Cardin and Coco Chanel and all of those folks in the fashion industry. Now, I find it fascinating, even though I'm not a fashionista. But if I could close, though, I want to second Frank's idea about proposing to a Biden administration in the second term. Of Trump administration, it's, who knows. The Biden administration needs ideas for trade. Whether they'll be receptive to them, I don't know. But an AI pact with Canada seems to be a great place to start.
Right.
And so I would highly recommend that idea.
All right, thank you. Endorsement of an AI pact. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this CJAI webinar. We were joined today by Bruce Stokes, the Honorable Perrin Beatty, Laura Dawson, and the Honorable Frank McKenna. You'll find Bruce's presentation on the CJA website. We'll be releasing this panel as a Global Exchange podcast, and we're also going to put it on YouTube. We thank our strategic sponsors, Lockheed Martin Canada, General Dynamics, Irving Shipbuilding, Onway Defense, and Cenovus Energy for making this webinar possible. My thanks also to our producer, Joe Calnan. I'm Colin Robertson. Thanks for joining us today.